He bought a slave simply to be a nanny for his motherless daughter, but when he discovered what she was doing every night in secret, his life changed completely. In the America of 1853, at the height of antebellum prosperity, men of Southern high society resolved their domestic needs by purchasing slaves as if they were furniture. Among plantation owners and wealthy merchants, hiring a slave nurse was common and convenient practice. Colonel William Harrison Beaumont was desperate to find someone who would care for his 3-year-old daughter after losing his wife during childbirth of their second child. He bought Catherine, a young 25-year-old slave, expecting only that she would keep the girl fed and clean. Catherine harbored secrets that went far beyond her duties. What began as a strictly professional relationship transformed into something neither of them expected. When William discovered that every night Catherine was teaching his daughter something forbidden by law, something that could cost both of them their freedom, but revealed a soul so extraordinary that it made the colonel question everything he believed in. When the truth about Catherine's past came to light, that she was not just a common slave, but a woman with education that rivaled his own, the scandal that followed shook the structures of Charleston society. The love that was born between them defied not only social conventions but the laws of the land. What happened when a powerful man discovered he had purchased not a servant but a teacher in disguise will show how true love can flourish in the most unlikely places and transform lives forever. Tell me from which city you are hearing this story, and prepare to discover how a simple decision can change the destiny of an entire family. Before we continue with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's strengthen our community so no one forgets these stories. Thank you, and let's continue. The slave market of Charleston, South Carolina, bustled on the humid morning of September 1853 when Colonel William Harrison Beaumont descended from his carriage with a specific objective and a heavy heart. At 34 years old, he had become a widower just 4 months earlier when his beloved wife Elizabeth died after complications in the birth of their second child, who also did not survive. William looked around the market with a mixture of disgust and resignation. He had never needed to purchase slaves personally, always delegating that responsibility to his overseers at his cotton plantation upriver. But the situation was desperate. His daughter Margaret, only 3 years old, had cried incessantly since her mother's death. She refused to eat properly and had dismissed 4 nurses consecutively with her difficult temperament. The child's grief manifested in tantrums, night terrors, and a stubborn refusal to accept comfort from anyone who tried to replace her mother. The morning air was thick with the smell of the harbor, salt and fish mixed with humanity packed too closely together. William felt his stomach turn as he observed families being separated, children clinging to their mothers, men being inspected like livestock. He had grown up surrounded by slavery, had inherited slaves with his father's plantation, but had never personally participated in this particular transaction. His late wife, Elizabeth, had always handled the domestic staff, and he had been content to remain ignorant of the ugly details. "I need a young woman, healthy, with experience caring for small children," he said to the trader, a rotunded and sweaty man named Theodore Marsh, who was known throughout Charleston for his inventory of house servants and who has infinite patience. "My daughter is challenging. She has been through a terrible loss and needs someone with a gentle temperament and a firm hand." "I have exactly what your honor seeks," replied Theodore, his piggy eyes lighting up at the prospect of a significant sale. He led William through the market to a more reserved area where the more expensive merchandise was kept, away from the common field hands and dock workers. A prime piece, young, strong, very clean, came from a plantation in Virginia where she cared for the master's children. Light-skinned, refined features, knows how to conduct herself in a gentleman's home. Worth every penny, I assure you. Among a group of women sitting on wooden benches, William saw a young woman who stood out from the others, not only for her beauty, but for her posture, while the others kept their eyes low in submission, resigned to their fate. This woman observed everything around her with an alert intelligence that intrigued him immediately. There was something in her bearing that suggested she had not been born to this station, though he could not quite identify what gave him that impression. Catherine was 25 years old, with light brown skin the color of caramel, black wavy hair tied in a simple braid that fell over one shoulder, and hazel eyes that seemed to guard deep secrets. She wore a faded blue cotton dress that had been mended in several places, but was remarkably clean given the circumstances. Her hands, William noticed, were delicate and well cared for, not the calloused hands of someone who worked in the fields or even at heavy domestic labor. Her nails were trimmed and neat. When she shifted position, her movements were graceful in a way that suggested education and deport. "This here is Catherine," said Theodore, with the practiced patter of a man who had sold hundreds of human beings. 25 years old, healthy as a horse, no vices, excellent with children, very obedient. She was trained up in a good Virginia household, knows all the proper ways, can so cook if needed, but her specialty is caring for little ones. The family that owned her fell on hard times, had to sell off their house stuff. "Their loss is your gain, Colonel." William approached, and Catherine raised her eyes to meet his. For an instant, he felt as if she could read his soul, as if those hazel eyes could see past his fine clothes and respected name, to the grief and desperation he carried within him. There was a depth in that gaze that unsettled him, an intelligence that seemed inappropriate for someone in her position. Slaves were supposed to be simple, uneducated, incapable of the kind of penetrating observation he saw in her face. "You have experience caring for small children?" he asked her directly, breaking protocol by addressing her rather than speaking only to the trader. "Yes, sir," Catherine responded with a soft but firm voice that carried a cultured accent he could not quite place. It was neither the thick dialect of the field slaves nor the affected speech of house servants trying to imitate their masters. "I have cared for many children over the years, from infancy through their early education." William noticed how she phrased her response, not just confirming experience, but providing additional information about the age range of her charges. Most slaves would have simply answered yes or no. "Difficult children," he pressed, "who cry a lot, don't want to eat, children who have lost their mothers." He saw something flicker in her eyes, a shadow of pain that suggested personal experience with loss. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "Children who are grieving require special care. They need patience, consistency, and someone who understands that their behavior is not defiance, but pain finding its way out." The observation was so perceptive, so exactly aligned with what the doctor had told him about Margaret's condition, that William felt his breath catch. He stared at Catherine, trying to understand how a slave could articulate what he himself had struggled to comprehend. "How did you know?" he asked quietly, forgetting for a moment that Theodore was listening. "How did you know about my daughter's situation?" "By the way you speak of the girl, sir," Catherine said, her voice gentle, "and by the sadness in your eyes. A man does not come to purchase a nurse with such urgency unless his need is desperate, and that kind of desperation usually comes from love and loss combined." Theodore shifted uncomfortably, clearly not pleased with his merchandise speaking so freely. "Now, Catherine, you just answer the gentleman's questions without all the extra words," he said sharply, but William held up a hand. "No, let her speak." He looked at Catherine intently. "You understand grief? You have seen it in children before?" "I have seen it in many forms, sir. In children who have lost parents, in parents who have lost children. Grief is grief, whether it wears fine clothes or rags." The philosophical response delivered with such simple dignity moved something in William's chest. This was no ordinary slave. Whatever her circumstances, however she had come to be standing on this auction block, there was something extraordinary about her. Theodore, sensing the sale was moving in his favor, pressed his advantage. "As you can see, Colonel, she's well-spoken and understands quality care. A girl like this, she'll fit right into your household, cause no trouble, and give your little daughter exactly what she needs." "How much?" William asked, still looking at Catherine rather than the trader. $800. Now, I know that seems steep, but for a skilled nurse of her quality, trained in a proper household, it's more than fair. I could get 1,000 for her easy from one of the families on Trad Street, but I like to see my merchandise go to good homes where they'll be appreciated. It was indeed a high price, nearly double what a field end would cost, and significantly more than most house servants. But William was desperate, and something about Catherine spoke to him on a level he could not quite articulate. Perhaps it was the hope that this unusual woman might succeed where others had failed. Perhaps it was simple desperation. Or perhaps it was something else, something he was not yet ready to name. "I'll pay it," he said. "Have your man draw up the papers." Theodore's face split into a broad smile. "Excellent choice, Colonel. I guarantee you won't regret it. Catherine here will serve you well." An hour later, William was leading Catherine to his carriage, her few possessions tied in a small cloth bundle. As they walked through the market, Catherine kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, despite the degradation of her circumstances. William noticed how other slaves seemed to defer to her, how even in this terrible place she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. The carriage was waiting on East Bay Street. William's driver, James, perched on the box. James himself, a slave who had been with the Beaumont family for 20 years, raised his eyebrows when he saw Catherine but said nothing, simply nodding respectfully as William handed her into the carriage. During the ride to William's mansion on King Street in the fashionable district south of Broad, William explained the situation in more detail. The carriage rolled through the elegant streets lined with palmetto trees and ornate iron gates past the gracious homes of Charleston's elite. "My daughter Margaret is 3 years old," he began, watching Catherine's face as he spoke. "She lost her mother 4 months ago during childbirth. My wife Elizabeth developed a fever after the delivery and did not survive. The child, a son, lived only 2 days. His voice caught slightly. "Since then, Margaret has been inconsolable. She cries for hours, refuses to eat more than a few bites at each meal, wakes screaming from nightmares. We have had 4 nurses attempt to care for her. The first 2 she simply wore down with her constant tears and demands. The third lost her temper and struck Margaret when the child would not stop crying. I dismissed her immediately. The fourth left yesterday saying she could not bear the strain any longer. The child is testing them," Catherine said thoughtfully. "When children lose a parent, especially their mother, they often become difficult as a way of testing whether the new caregiver will also abandon them. Each time a nurse leaves, it confirms Margaret's fear that everyone she loves will disappear." William stared at her. "That is exactly what Dr. Piton said. How do you know this?" "I have cared for children in mourning before, sir. The patterns are similar regardless of the circumstances." "You said earlier that the father must be considered as well." "What did you mean?" Catherine hesitated as if weighing how much honesty she could afford. Children are sensitive to the emotions of adults around them. If Margaret sees that her father is also grieving, if she senses his sadness and perhaps his difficulty in caring for her while managing his own pain, she may be reacting to that as much as to her mother's absence. Sometimes children act out because they do not know how else to express that they see their parents suffering. The insight cut straight to William's heart. He had been trying so hard to maintain his composure to be strong for Margaret, but the effort of suppressing his own grief while trying to comfort his daughter had been exhausting. At night, alone in the bedroom he had shared with Elizabeth, he wept, but in front of Margaret and the household staff, he maintained the stoic facade expected of a Southern gentleman. "You seem to understand a great deal about the human heart," he said quietly. "Where did you learn such things?" "Life teaches many things, sir," Catherine replied, turning to look out the window at the passing houses. "Loss is a universal teacher." They rode in silence for a few minutes before William spoke again. "You will be responsible for all of Margaret's care, feeding, bathing, dressing, entertaining, and putting her to bed. The household is managed by Mrs. Beatrice Thornton, who has been our housekeeper for 15 years. She runs a tight ship and expects all staff to maintain high standards. You will take your meals in the servants' dining room and report any concerns about Margaret directly to Mrs. Thornton, nor to me. Will I be permitted to take Margaret outside to the garden or for walks?" The question surprised him. Most slaves would not presume to ask about their duties but would simply wait to be told. "Yes, of course, fresh air and exercise are important for children. Our garden is secure and private. And if Margaret needs something, clothing or books or toys, how shall I communicate that books?" William repeated. "You think she needs books? She's only 3 years old. Children are never too young for stories, sir. And if she is learning to speak well, picture books can help develop her vocabulary." Again, William found himself surprised by Catherine's insights. "I will see that you have appropriate materials for her care and education." When they arrived at the mansion, Catherine stepped down from the carriage and looked up at the impressive 3-story structure with its tall columns and wide piazzas. The house was one of the finest on King Street, built of Charleston gray brick with white trim, surrounded by elaborate gardens enclosed by iron fencing. William watched her face, expecting to see the awe that most slaves showed when first seeing such wealth. Instead, Catherine's expression was thoughtful, analytical, as if she were cataloging the household rather than being overwhelmed by it. Mrs. Beatrice Thornton was waiting in the entrance hall, a tall woman with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She looked Catherine up and down with an expression that suggested skepticism. "This is Catherine," William said. "She will be caring for Margaret. Please show her to the quarters we prepared and then bring Margaret to meet her. I will be in my study if needed." "Yes, sir," Mrs. Thornton said crisply. She turned to Catherine. "Follow me." As William climbed the stairs to his second-floor study, he heard Mrs. Thornton's voice echoing in the stairwell as she led Catherine upward. "I run a proper household here. Cleanliness, punctuality, and obedience are expected at all times. The Colonel is a good master, but he will not tolerate laziness or insubordination. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Catherine's voice responded, clear and respectful, but not servile. William found himself hoping that Catherine would not be cowed by Mrs. Thornton's severity. The housekeeper was efficient and loyal, but she ruled the domestic staff with an iron hand and had little patience for what she considered weakness or sentiment. The room designated for Catherine was on the second floor in the rear of the house next to Margaret's nursery. It was small but comfortable by the standards of servants' quarters, with a narrow bed covered in a simple quilt, a chest of drawers for her clothing, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a single chair near the window. The window itself looked out over the back garden, offering a view of the carefully tended roses and the old oak tree that dominated the space. "This is your room," Mrs. Thornton said. "Keep it neat. There will be an inspection every Saturday morning. Meals are served in the servants' dining room at 6:00 in the morning, noon, and 6:00 in the evening. You will eat with the other house staff. Miss Margaret takes her meals in the nursery, and you will be responsible for ensuring she eats properly. Her clothes are in the wardrobe in her room. She has a bath every evening before bed. Any questions?" "May I ask what Miss Margaret's routine has been?" Catherine asked. "What time does she wake? When does she nap? What are her preferences for food and play?" Mrs. Thornton's expression softened slightly. "She wakes early, usually by 6:00. She used to nap after lunch, but lately she fights sleep and often cries herself into exhaustion by mid-afternoon. She picks at her food, especially vegetables. She used to enjoy playing with her dolls and looking at picture books with her mother. But since Mrs. Beaumont passed, she has shown little interest in toys." The housekeeper's voice held a note of sadness. "She was such a happy child before. Now she just seems lost. I will do my best to help her find her way back," Catherine said gently. "See that you do. The Colonel loves that child more than anything in this world. If you can ease her suffering, you will have his eternal gratitude." After Mrs. Thornton left to fetch Margaret, Catherine stood alone in her small room. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden, taking several deep breaths. 3 years since her kidnapping. 3 years of hiding who she really was. 3 years of enduring degradation and fear. And now she was here in this beautiful house charged with caring for a motherless child. Perhaps she thought this was where her luck might finally turn. She heard small footsteps in the hall accompanied by Mrs. Thornton's heavier tread. Catherine turned from the window and straightened her spine, preparing to meet her new charge. Margaret was a tiny thing, smaller than Catherine had expected for 3 years old. She had blonde, curly hair that had been carefully combed, but was already coming loose from its ribbons and enormous blue eyes that dominated her small, pale face. The child was thin, too thin, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights. She wore a beautiful white dress with blue embroidery, but it hung loosely on her small frame. She clutched a worn rag doll in one hand and had the other hand firmly attached to Mrs. Thornton's skirt. "Miss Margaret, this is Catherine," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice gentler than it had been when speaking to Catherine alone. "She has come to take care of you." Margaret stared at Catherine with solemn, suspicious eyes. Her lower lip trembled slightly, as if she were already preparing to cry. Catherine knelt down slowly, bringing herself to the child's eye level. She made no move to approach or touch Margaret, simply smiled softly. "Hello, Margaret," she said in a gentle voice. "My name is Catherine. I came to be your friend." Margaret did not respond, only pressed herself more firmly against Mrs. Thornton's leg, her eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "You have very beautiful eyes," Catherine continued, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. "They are the color of the sky on a clear summer day. I bet your mama used to tell you that. I bet she told you that you have the prettiest eyes she ever saw." At the mention of her mother, Margaret's face crumpled and tears began to stream down her cheeks. Mrs. Thornton looked alarmed and was about to speak when Catherine did something unexpected. She began to sing very softly a melody that seemed to come from another world entirely. The words were in a language neither Margaret nor Mrs. Thornton recognized, something African and ancient, but the melody was achingly beautiful, full of longing and comfort in equal measure. Margaret's sobs began to quiet. She loosened her grip on Mrs. Thornton's skirt and took a half-step forward, her eyes wide and fixed on Catherine's face. The tears still flowed, but silently now, as if the music had given her grief a gentler form of expression. When the song ended, the room was silent except for Margaret's shaky breathing. The child had moved several steps closer to Catherine without seeming to realize it. "That was beautiful, Mrs. Baum," Thornton said quietly. "I have never heard anything like it." William's voice came from the doorway. "What language was that?" Catherine turned startled. She had not heard him approach. He stood in the doorway with an expression of wonder on his face. "An African lullaby, sir," she said, rising from her kneeling position. "My mother taught it to me when I was very small. It speaks of stars that watch over children while they sleep, protecting them and keeping them safe through the night." "You speak African?" William asked, moving into the room. "Some words and phrases, sir. My mother came from Africa originally and remembered some of the old songs." William looked at his daughter, who was still staring at Catherine with rapt attention. It was the first time in weeks that Margaret had shown interest in anything beyond her own grief. "Margaret, sweetheart," he said gently, crouching down beside his daughter. "Do you like Catherine singing?" Margaret nodded slowly, still not speaking. "Would you like her to stay and take care of you, to sing to you and play with you?" Another small nod. William felt something loosen in his chest, a tiny seed of hope. "Catherine, would you mind staying with Margaret for the rest of the afternoon? I think she is comfortable with you." "Of course, sir, I would be honored." In the days that followed, William found himself observing Catherine with growing fascination and curiosity. She moved through the household with quiet efficiency, her entire focus on Margaret. The transformation in his daughter was gradual but unmistakable. The constant crying diminished. Margaret began to eat more at meals, still picking at her food, but consuming enough to ease William's worries. The night terrors continued, but Catherine seemed to have a gift for soothing the child back to sleep. William would sometimes wake in the night to hear that strange, beautiful African melody floating through the house, and he would know that Catherine was singing Margaret out of a nightmare. More remarkably, Margaret began to smile again. Small smiles at first, fleeting and fragile, but real. She laughed at something Catherine said during breakfast. She played with her dolls while Catherine sewed. She asked questions about the flowers in the garden as Catherine walked with her among the roses. William watched these developments with relief and gratitude, but also with growing puzzlement. Catherine was unlike any slave he had ever known. Her speech was too refined, her knowledge too broad, her manner too confident. She never overstepped the boundaries of her position, always addressing him and Mrs. Thornton with proper respect. But there was something in her bearing that suggested she was playing a role rather than living her natural state. He noticed little things, the way she held a book when she looked at picture books with Margaret, as if she were reading rather than simply looking at illustrations. The grace of her movements, more like a lady than a servant. The vocabulary she used, words like consistency and temperament, and anxiety that seemed beyond what a slave would know. Her posture always upright, her hands always clean and well kept despite her work. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Catherine's arrival, William was working in his study when he heard voices from the garden below. He walked to the window and looked down to see Catherine and Margaret sitting on a blanket under the oak tree. Margaret was laughing at something, actually laughing, a sound William had feared he might never hear again. Catherine was helping her make chains from clover flowers, their heads bent together over the work. "You are a quick learner, Miss Margaret," Catherine was saying, her voice clear in the quiet afternoon air. "See how you make the loop and thread the next stem through. That is the way. You could be a fine seamstress one day if you wished, or you could make beautiful things just for the joy of creating them." "Will you always stay with me?" Margaret asked, her child's voice plaintive. "Will you be my mama now?" William's breath caught. He leaned closer to the window, desperate to hear Catherine's response. "I will stay with you as long as your papa wishes me to," Catherine said gently. "I cannot be your mama because you already have a mama up in heaven watching over you, but I can be your friend and your teacher and someone who loves you very much. Would that be all right?" "I suppose," Margaret said, "but I wish you could be my mama too. Then you could never leave. People we love do not really leave us, sweetheart. They live in our hearts. Your mama will always be part of you in your pretty eyes and your kind heart and your curiosity about the world. And I promise that as long as I am with you, I will take care of you and teach you and help you grow into the wonderful person you are meant to be." William felt tears prick his eyes. This woman, this slave whose name he barely knew, was giving his daughter something precious beyond measure. She was giving her permission to grieve while also giving her hope for the future. She was not trying to replace Elizabeth, but rather helping Margaret learn to live with her loss. That evening, after Margaret was asleep, William asked Mrs. Thornton about Catherine's behavior. "She is exceptional, sir," the housekeeper said. "I have never seen anyone connect with a child so quickly. Miss Margaret has not cried during the day for nearly a week now. She eats her vegetables when Catherine tells her stories about how food helps us grow strong. She goes to bed without fuss. It is remarkable. What do you know about Catherine's background? Where she came from before?" Mrs. Thornton shrugged. "Only what the trader told you, sir. From Virginia, trained in a good household. Why do you ask? Does she seem like other slaves to you?" The housekeeper paused, considering. "Now that you mention it, sir, no. She speaks quite well, better than many white women of my acquaintance, if I am honest, and she has a way about her, a kind of dignity that is unusual, but she works hard and causes no trouble, so I have no complaints. Have you seen her reading?" "Reading, sir?" Mrs. Thornton looked shocked. "Certainly not. That would be illegal. Why would you think?" "Just a question," William said quickly. "She seems educated, that is all." "Well, somehow slaves pick up refined ways from their masters. Perhaps that is all it is." But William did not think that was all it was. Over the next several days, he paid closer attention, and what he observed only deepened his conviction that Catherine was hiding something significant about her past. She was too knowledgeable about too many things. When Margaret asked about birds in the garden, Catherine could identify them by species and tell the child about their habits. When Margaret wondered about the stars, Catherine explained constellations with a precision that suggested formal education. She spoke French phrases occasionally, translating them for Margaret as if teaching a foreign language were the most natural thing in the world. And then, 2 weeks later, William discovered the truth in a way that left him shaken to his core. It was a warm October evening, and William was working late in his study on correspondence related to his plantation business. The house was quiet. The servants retired to their quarters, Margaret long since asleep. He had been working for several hours when he realized he needed a particular ledger from the library on the 3rd floor. As he climbed the stairs, he heard a soft voice coming from Margaret's room. He paused on the landing, listening. It was Catherine's voice, but she was not singing or telling stories. She was speaking in a measured instructional tone that made William's blood run cold. "This is the letter A, Margaret. It makes the sound R like an apple or A like an able. And this letter is B, which makes the sound B like in ball or book." William moved silently to Margaret's door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see Catherine sitting on Margaret's bed with his daughter nestled against her side. Between them was a primer, a basic reading book, and Catherine was systematically teaching Margaret to recognize letters and their sounds. Teaching a slave to read was illegal throughout the South, punishable by fines and imprisonment. Teaching any enslaved person to read and write was considered dangerous, a path to rebellion and insurrection. But more shocking than the illegality was the fact that Catherine obviously knew how to read and read well. She was not stumbling through the primer, but moving through it with the confidence and skill of an experienced teacher. William stood frozen in the hallway, watching as Catherine patiently guided Margaret's small finger from letter to letter, asking questions to check her understanding, offering praise and encouragement. His mind raced with questions and implications. How had a slave learned to read so well? Where had she received such obvious education? And why was she risking severe punishment to teach his daughter? He watched for perhaps 10 minutes before silently retreating down the hallway to his study. He closed the door and sat in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He should confront her immediately. He should summon the authorities. Teaching slaves to read was not just illegal, but considered a threat to the entire social order. If word got out that he was harboring a literate slave who was teaching his daughter, his reputation would be destroyed. But even as these thoughts ran through his mind, William found he could not muster the appropriate outrage. Instead, he felt a strange mixture of awe and curiosity. Who was Catherine really? How had she acquired such education? And what kind of extraordinary woman would risk everything to teach a 3-year-old child to read? He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his study and thought about everything he had observed over the past weeks. Catherine's refined speech, her knowledge of history and science and languages, her graceful movements and proper posture, her ability to connect with Margaret on a level that suggested not just experience with children, but genuine education in pedagogy. None of it fit with her supposed background as a slave trained in a Virginia household. By morning, William had made a decision. He would confront Catherine privately and demand the truth. If she had been lying about her past, he needed to know, but he would hear her out before deciding what action to take. He waited until afternoon when Margaret was napping. He asked Mrs. Thornton to ensure they would not be disturbed and summoned Catherine to his study. She entered with her usual composure, though he thought he detected a hint of apprehension in her eyes. She stood before his desk with her hands folded, her posture perfect, waiting for him to speak. "Catherine," he began, deciding to be direct. "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady. "Where were you born?" "In Maryland, sir." "Which plantation?" "I was not born on a plantation, sir. I was born in Baltimore." The answer was not what he expected. Slaves were not generally born in cities unless their mothers were house servants for urban families. "What was your mother's name?" "Sarah Mitchell." "And your father?" Catherine hesitated for just a moment. "James Mitchell. They were both slaves." "No, sir." William leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What were they?" "They were free people of color, sir." The room seemed to spin. "You are telling me you were born free?" "Yes, sir." "Then how?" He could not finish the sentence, but Catherine understood. "I was kidnapped, sir, 3 years ago. My parents had both died, and I was living alone in Baltimore. Men came in the night, men who claimed my father owed them money. They destroyed my freedom papers and sold me to a trader who falsified documents saying I had been born a slave. I have been sold 4 times since then, passed from place to place before ending up in Charleston." William felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. If what she was saying was true, if she really had been born free, then he had not purchased a slave at all. He had purchased a free woman who had been illegally enslaved. The implications were staggering. "Can you prove any of this?" he asked. "My documents were destroyed. My house was burned. Anyone who knew my family is in Baltimore and who would believe them against the word of white men with legal papers, false though they may be." "How did you learn to read?" "My father taught me. He was a skilled carpenter, a respected man in the free-colored community. He believed education was essential. I can read and write in English and French. I studied mathematics, history, geography. My father wanted me to be able to support myself, to never be dependent on anyone." "I saw you teaching Margaret last night," William said quietly. "I saw you with the primer." Catherine's face went pale. "Sir, do you know what could happen to you if I reported this to both of us?" "Yes, sir. I know. I am sorry. I should not have presumed. It is just that Margaret is so bright, so eager to learn, and it seemed wrong to let her mind lie out when she could be developing it. But I understand if you must punish me. I accept the consequences." She stood before him with perfect dignity, ready to face whatever judgment he would render. And in that moment, William realized that everything about her made sense now. She was not a slave trying to act like a free person. She was a free person who had been forced into slavery. And even under that burden, her true nature shone through. "Catherine," he said slowly, "if what you are telling me is true, if you were really born free, then you are being held illegally. I would have purchased you under false pretenses." "That is correct, sir. Why did you not say something before when I first bought you? Would you have believed me? A colored woman in a slave market claiming to be free. Mr. Marsh had legal documents, false though they were. I have nothing but my word." She was right, of course. In the social and legal structure of the South, a slave's testimony was worthless against a white man's documents. "I need time to think about this," William said. This is more complex than I can process immediately." "I understand, sir. May I ask what you intend to do?" "I do not know yet, but, Catherine," he looked at her intently, "I want the truth. All of it. I want to know exactly what happened to you, who you were before, how you ended up here. Can you tell me that?" "Yes, sir. If you truly want to know, I will tell you everything. Come back tonight after Margaret is asleep. We will talk then privately." Catherine nodded and left the study, and William sat alone with his thoughts churning. If Catherine's story was true, then he had an enormous decision to make. He could ignore what he had learned, continue to keep her as a slave, and no one would be the wiser. He could report her literacy and have her sold away, removing the problem from his household. Or he could investigate her claims, and if they proved true, help her recover her freedom. The last option would cost him $800 and would deprive Margaret of the best caregiver she had ever had. It would also be the right thing to do. That night, after the household had settled and Margaret was sleeping soundly, Catherine came to his study. William had prepared a fire against the evening chill and had 2 chairs arranged so they could speak face to face rather than across the formal barrier of his desk. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs, "and tell me your story, all of it." Catherine sat, took a deep breath, and began. My father, James Mitchell, was born a slave on a tobacco plantation in southern Maryland when he was 25 years old. His master died, and in his will manumitted several of his slaves, including my father. My father was a talented carpenter, and he used his skills to build a good life. He moved to Baltimore and established himself as a craftsman. He made furniture, did construction work, built a reputation for quality and reliability. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. My mother, Sarah, was born free. Her parents had purchased their freedom years before she was born. She worked as a seamstress and was known for her beautiful work. My parents met at church, married, and I was born in 1828. They named me Catherine after my grandmother. You were educated from childhood? William asked. Yes. My father insisted on it. He said that slavery had stolen his childhood and his youth, and he was determined that I would have every advantage. He hired a tutor for me when I was 5. By the time I was 10, I could read English and French, do mathematics through algebra, and knew history and geography, as well as any white child in a good school. What happened to your parents? Pain flashed across Catherine's face. My mother died of consumption when I was 20. My father never really recovered from losing her. He continued to work, but his heart was broken. 2 years later, in 1850, he was killed in an accident at a construction site. A wall collapsed and crushed him. I am sorry, William said, and meant it. He left me the house we lived in, his tools, some savings. It was not a fortune, but it was enough for me to live modestly. I supported myself doing needlework and teaching, reading and writing to children in the free colored community. I had a small but good life. I was not wealthy, but I was free and independent. That was everything. What happened 3 years ago? 2 men came to my door one night in August. They said my father had owed them money, gambling debts they claimed. I told them that was impossible, that my father did not gamble. They insisted. They said I would have to work off his debts. When I refused and showed them his papers, proving there were no outstanding debts, they became violent. They beat me, tied me up, and burned my house to the ground. Everything I owned, all my father's papers, my freedom certificate, my mother's Bible, everything was destroyed. Her voice remained steady, but William could see the pain in her eyes. They kept me locked in a cellar for weeks while they arranged false papers saying I'd been born a slave named Catherine with no surname. Born in 1828 in Virginia, they sold me to a trader who took me south. I tried to tell people the truth at first, but no one would listen. A colored woman's word meant nothing against white men with legal documents. I was beaten for lying, beaten for trying to escape, beaten for being difficult. Eventually, I learned to stay silent and wait for an opportunity. But you never stopped being who you were, William observed. No, they could take my freedom, but they could not take my mind or my education or my sense of self. I hid it as best I could, spoke simply, kept my eyes down, acted the part they expected. But inside I was still Catherine Mitchell, daughter of James and Sarah, a free woman of Baltimore. I just could not prove it to anyone. William sat back in his chair trying to imagine what she had endured. 3 years of forced servitude, of hiding her true self, of living in fear of discovery and punishment, and yet she had maintained her dignity and her core identity. Why did you teach Margaret to read? He asked. You must have known it was dangerous. Because she is so bright, and because education is the one thing no one can take from her. If I have learned anything from my life, it is that circumstances can change in an instant. Wealth can vanish. Freedom can be stolen. Security is an illusion. But knowledge once gained remains. I wanted to give Margaret something that would be hers no matter what the future brings. And she hesitated. And what? And because it gave me joy to teach again, to use my mind and my skills for their proper purpose, for a few minutes each night while I taught Margaret her letters. I was not a slave. I was a teacher, the person my parents raised me to be. It was a small rebellion, perhaps, but it was important to me. William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden. He stood there for a long moment, thinking about everything Catherine had told him, weighing his options and his responsibilities. Catherine, he said finally, turning back to face her, I am going to investigate your story. I will write to people in Baltimore, search for records, see if I can find any evidence that supports what you have told me. If your story proves true, I will help you recover your freedom. You have my word on that. He saw tears spring to her eyes for the first time since he had known her. Do you mean that, sir? I do. I cannot undo the injustice that was done to you, but I can refuse to perpetuate it. If you were born free, then you should be free. Thank you, she whispered. You cannot know what that means to me. In the meantime, you will continue to care for Margaret, and you will continue to teach her to read, but discreetly. If anyone asks, you are simply looking at picture books with her. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Catherine, I need to ask you something else. When you are free, what will you do? Where will you go? She looked at him with those clear hazel eyes. I do not know, sir. I have no family left, no home to return to. Baltimore holds nothing but painful memories now. I suppose I will have to find some way to support myself, perhaps return to teaching or needlework. And Margaret. What about her? The pain that crossed Catherine's face was evident. I will miss her terribly. She has become like a daughter to me, but I cannot ask you to keep me as an employee when I regain my freedom. The social complications would be. She trailed off. Would you want to stay if it were possible? More than anything. But sir, surely you see how impossible that would be. A free woman of color working in your household, the scandal it would cause, and Margaret's future to think of. She needs to grow up as part of Charleston society, not as the daughter of a man who employed a colored woman in his home. Let me worry about society. William said, You worry about Margaret. She loves you, Catherine. Losing you would devastate her after everything she has already lost. And I love her. But love does not always determine what is possible. William wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that he was beginning to realize his feelings for her went beyond gratitude, beyond respect for her intelligence and strength. But it was too soon, too complicated, too dangerous to voice such thoughts. Instead, he simply nodded. Get some rest. We will speak more after I have had time to investigate your claims. Over the next 6 weeks, William devoted considerable time and resources to investigating Catherine's story. He wrote letters to officials in Baltimore, to churches that kept records of free colored people, to carpenters' guilds that might have known James Mitchell. He hired a private investigator to search for records and interview people in Baltimore's free colored community. The responses came slowly, but they came. Yes, James Mitchell had been a respected carpenter in Baltimore. Yes, he had been a freed slave who built a successful business. Yes, he had married Sarah Washington in 1825, and they had a daughter named Catherine, born in 1828. Yes, his house had burned in August 1850, shortly after his death, though at the time it had been assumed to be an accident. And yes, his daughter Catherine had disappeared around that same time and was assumed to have perished in the fire. When William sat down with all the documentation spread before him, he knew beyond doubt that Catherine had told him the truth. She was a free woman, illegally enslaved, and he had unknowingly purchased stolen property. The legal situation was complex. Simply freeing Catherine would not restore her legitimate status as a freeborn woman. She would need proper documentation, proof of her birth status, legal recognition of the fraud that had been perpetrated against her. William consulted with a lawyer who was known for his progressive views, swearing him to secrecy about the case. It can be done, the lawyer told him, but it will take time and money. We will need to file documents in Maryland courts, get testimony from people who knew her family, prove that the slave papers are fraudulent. It could take months, maybe a year. Do it, William said, whatever it takes. While the legal process is ground forward, life in the Beaumont household continued. Margaret thrived under Catherine's care, growing stronger and happier with each passing week. The child's grief had not disappeared, but it had become manageable, woven into her daily life rather than overwhelming it. She spoke often of her mother now, asking Catherine questions about heaven and angels, working through her understanding of death with the help of Catherine's patient explanations. And every night, Catherine taught Margaret to read. By November, the child could recognize all her letters. By December, she was sounding out simple words. By January, she was reading basic sentences from her primer. It was remarkable progress for such a young child, testament to both Margaret's intelligence and Catherine's skill as a teacher. William found himself drawn more and more to Catherine's company. He began inventing reasons to observe her lessons with Margaret, sitting quietly in a corner of the nursery. While Catherine taught, he engaged her in conversations about Margaret's development, discussions that inevitably broadened into talk of education, philosophy, literature, politics. He discovered that she was as knowledgeable and thoughtful as any educated person he knew, with opinions on everything from the poetry of Wordsworth to the political situation in Europe. He was falling in love with her, he realized, sometime around Christmas. It was not just her beauty, though she was beautiful, or her intelligence, though she was brilliant. It was the totality of who she was, the strength that had sustained her through unimaginable hardship, the kindness she showed to his daughter, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself even in the degrading position slavery had forced upon her. But he said nothing. The social barriers between them were enormous. Even when she was legally free, she would still be a woman of color in the slave-holding South, and he was a white man of the planter class. A romantic relationship between them would be scandalous, potentially dangerous for both of them, and certainly damaging to Margaret's future prospects in Charleston society. So he remained silent, watching and waiting, wondering if the feelings he saw reflected in Catherine's eyes when she looked at him were real or merely his own wishful thinking. In March 1854, 6 months after Catherine had arrived in his household, the legal documents finally came through. Catherine Mitchell, freeborn woman of color, had been officially recognized by the Maryland courts as having been illegally enslaved. The fraudulent documents had been nullified. Her freedom was restored. William arranged for a small ceremony at the courthouse in Charleston with his lawyer and Mrs. Thornton present as witnesses. Catherine stood before the judge and received her freedom papers, legal documents that proved beyond doubt her status as a free woman. When she walked out of that courthouse, she was no longer anyone's property. She belonged to herself alone. That evening, William asked to speak with her privately in his study. She came dressed in a simple but clean dress that Mrs. Thornton had given her, her freedom papers clutched in her hands, as if she feared they might disappear if she let them go. "How do you feel?" William asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "For 3 years I dreamed of this moment, and now that it is here, I realize I have no idea what to do next." "You could stay," William said, "not as a slave, obviously, but as Margaret's governess. I would pay you a salary, provide you with good quarters, respect your free status. You could continue to teach Margaret and live here in safety and comfort." "Why would you do that?" Catherine asked softly. "You know the scandal it would cause to employ a free woman of color in your household. Because Margaret needs you. Because he hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. Because I have come to value your presence in this house, in my life, more than I can easily express. Because the thought of you leaving is unbearable." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. "William," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I need to be honest with you. I have developed feelings for you that go beyond gratitude. When I am near you, my heart races. When you speak, I hang on your every word. I think about you constantly. But feelings do not change reality. Even if I stay as an employee, society will judge us harshly, and if we ever acted on these feelings, the consequences would be severe." "I know," William said. "I have thought of little else for months. The social barriers are real and significant, but Catherine, I am in love with you, completely, hopelessly in love, and I think you love me too." "I do," she whispered. "God help me, I do. But love is not enough. What if we made it enough? What if we decided that our happiness matters more than social approval? And Margaret, what about her future? If you marry a colored woman, her prospects in Charleston society will be destroyed. She will be ostracized, mocked, made to suffer for your choice." William had thought about this extensively. Or she will learn that love and justice matter more than prejudice. She will grow up in a household that values character over skin color, education over empty social pretensions. She will be stronger for it. "You are asking me to be brave enough to marry you," Catherine said. "But are you brave enough to face what that will mean? The loss of friends, business partnerships destroyed, social standing ruined. I would rather be ruined with you than respected without you." Catherine closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "This is madness. This is impossible." "Then let us be mad and impossible together." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "If we do this, there is no going back. Once you marry me, Charleston society will never accept you again. Then we will find new society. There are progressive communities in the North, places where an interracial couple might live in relative peace. We could move, start fresh somewhere that Margaret could grow up without the poison of slavery all around her. You would give up your plantation, your heritage, everything you know. I would give up anything for you and Margaret. You have both become my whole world." Catherine moved toward him, then closing the distance between them, she reached up and touched his face gently. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, not because it makes sense or because it is easy, but because I love you and because life is too short to deny love when we find it." William pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and in that moment, the impossible became real. They married quietly 3 months later in June 1854 in a small ceremony performed by an abolitionist minister in a private home. Margaret, now 4 years old, was thrilled to have Catherine officially become her new mother. Mrs. Thornton stood as witness, having come to love Catherine like a daughter and respecting William's courage in following his heart. The reaction from Charleston society was swift and brutal. Friends cut off contact. Business partners withdrew from deals. Social invitations stopped coming. William's name was removed from club membership lists. There were editorials in newspapers condemning him. Sermons preached against the degradation of allowing interracial marriage. Threats delivered anonymously to their door. But there were also unexpected allies. Some of the more progressive families, those with abolitionist sympathies, reached out in support. A few business contacts proved more loyal than William had dared hope, and slowly, carefully, they began to build a new life that did not depend on Charleston's approval. True to his word, William eventually sold his plantation and moved his family north to Philadelphia, where laws against interracial marriage were not enforced, and where a free colored woman married to a white man could live without constant fear. It was there that Margaret grew into a confident, educated young woman, fluent in 3 languages, passionate about social justice, unafraid to challenge injustice wherever she encountered it. Years later, when Margaret was grown and married herself to a progressive young lawyer who shared her values, she would tell people about her unusual family. "My father," she would say, "bought a slave to care for me after my mother died. But he discovered he had bought not a servant, but a teacher, not property, but a person of extraordinary gifts. And he had the courage to admit his error, correct the injustice, and follow his heart even when society condemned him for it. My mother lost her freedom to cruelty and greed, but she never lost herself. And together, my parents built a family based on love and respect rather than law and custom. They taught me that human dignity matters more than social approval, that love sees beyond color, and that courage means doing what is right, even when it costs you everything." Catherine and William's story became one that people told when they needed to believe that love could triumph over prejudice, that individuals could stand against unjust systems, and that families built on genuine affection and respect were stronger than those built on social convention. On quiet evenings when the house was still and Margaret was asleep, Catherine would sometimes take out her freedom papers and read them, still hardly believing they were real, and William would watch her, marveling that this extraordinary woman had come into his life in such an unlikely way. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her once. "The difficulties we have faced, the losses we have endured." Catherine looked at him with those clear hazel eyes that had first captivated him in a Charleston slave market years before. "I regret the injustice that brought us together," she said. "I regret the years I lost to slavery. But I do not regret loving you or this family we have built or the life we have made despite everything working against us. What we have is worth every struggle." And in the end, that was the truth that sustained them through every difficulty, every challenge, every moment. When the weight of society's disapproval threatened to crush them, they had found something rare and precious, a love built on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to stand together against a world that said they should be apart. Years later, when historians look back at the antebellum period, they would find many stories of slavery's cruelty and injustice. But they would also find occasional stories like Catherine and William's. Stories that prove that even in the darkest times, individuals could choose humanity over hate, love over law, and justice over convenience. These stories mattered not because they were common, but because they showed what was possible when people had the courage to live according to their deepest values rather than their society's shallowest prejudices. And so Catherine Mitchell Beaumont, who had been born free, stolen into slavery, and freed again by love and justice, lived to see the end of slavery in America. She lived to see her daughter become a leader in the women's suffrage movement. She lived to teach hundreds of children, both black and white, in the school she established in Philadelphia. And she lived to grow old beside the man who had been brave enough to see her humanity when the law said she was property, and to choose love when society demanded he choose status instead. Their story reminds us that freedom is not just a legal status, but a state of being. That love can flourish in the most unlikely circumstances, and that the courage to do what is right, even at great personal cost, is the foundation of all true progress. In a world that tried to reduce Catherine to property and William to his social position, they chose instead to be fully human, fully themselves, and fully committed to building a life based on their deepest values. And that choice made in a moment of courage in 1854, Charleston echoed forward through generations, touching everyone who heard their story and dared to believe that they too could choose love over fear, justice over convenience, and hope over despair. Tell me from which city you are hearing this story, And which part touched your heart most? What moves you most about stories where people fight against injustice for love? Leave your like if this story of William and Catherine reached your soul, and subscribe for more stories that show how true love can transform lives and societies. Because we all deserve to believe that our humanity is worth more than any label society places on, 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 society places on,